On February 16th, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that fertilized eggs, in this case, frozen embryos used for in vitro fertilization, have the same legal status as children in civil cases. There's a lot of big terms used in this ruling, like extrauterine children. So, can you just please explain for us in layman's terms what happened and why this case is unprecedented?
Yeah, so this began with three families in South Alabama who had used a fertility clinic in Mobile. Uh, all three families had successfully used IVF to create pregnancies and to have children, but they had extra embryos stored in a cryogenic freezer. In 2020, a patient who was at the hospital, which was attached to this facility, wandered into that area, which was unlocked, and removed the embryos for these three families, dropped them on the floor, and, destroyed them. So the three families went to court trying to sue for wrongful death and a few other things. Basically, the trial judge threw out that claim, saying that embryos did not count as children. Eventually, that case wound up at the Alabama Supreme Court, and that is how we got here. The Supreme Court disagreed with that trial judge and said that in Alabama, fertilized eggs and embryos count as children. So that was the reason that this is unprecedented, is that there have been efforts to sue for wrongful death in the past for fertility for embryos that have been destroyed in other mishaps, and no other state court has ever recognized that. So Alabama is really the first to say that frozen embryos are children.
And we've been hearing from a lot of people. There's a lot of worry and a lot of fret over this ruling and what this could mean for families who are trying to get pregnant, for people who are trying to get pregnant in the state of Alabama right now. And we are recording this on February 21st at 1:45. And just this morning, UAB, the state's largest healthcare provider, announced that they are temporarily pausing IVF treatment. What is their rationale, and what does this mean for people who are trying to have children using IVF through UAB?
So UAB said they were going to pause this while they kind of looked at all the legal implications. If embryos are children, under civil law, the most immediate concern for them is their liability, whether people will file lawsuits whenever this process goes wrong. Not all embryos survive the thawing or the transfer process. That, it's gotten a lot better, but it's not 100%. And so clinics, doctors are worried that, there could be lawsuits first off. And there's even some concern out there about criminal prosecution. Should be clear that the Alabama Supreme Court really didn't broach the issue of criminal prosecution here. They were just looking at a civil case. But if they went out on a limb to basically define a child as a fertilized egg and an early stage embryo, that does raise a lot of questions. And you have to wonder whether a criminal case could follow. And if it does, what the Alabama Supreme Court is going to do with that.
Yeah, if I'm understanding you correctly, they basically said that the Alabama Constitution says that an embryo is a child. And so if they're setting that precedent, it has not yet, but it could spill over into criminal complaints as well.
I mean, that's the concern.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. For people who haven't gone through this process, how does IVF work? How are these embryos stored? How are they implanted? And what is the risk of unused embryos being destroyed?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I guess I should start with, there are a lot of reasons people might use IVF to become pregnant. Like in some cases, women suffering from endometriosis, or maybe they have blocked or non-existent fallopian tubes, something like that won't allow a fertilized egg to travel to the uterus. They may have to rely on IVF. Another big reason is for families that are carriers of genetic diseases. Some of these diseases can cause death really early in life. And so families sometimes want to have an embryo that they can test, or several embryos that they can test to make sure they're implanting a healthy one. The way it works is that, a woman will take shots for like 7 to 10 days to get her eggs to kind of mature. Someone goes in and removes several eggs, and they will, fertilize the eggs with in the lab. So that creates these really early stage embryos, fertilized eggs first, and then they become embryos. Basically, the clinic will go through and figure out which of those embryos look like the healthiest ones, and then transfer, usually one at a time, maybe two at a time, but a small number into the woman's uterus, and then the rest will go into storage. And that's where they're cryogenically frozen for a later date. Sometimes people come back if they want a sibling, and we'll have one of those thawed and transferred. Sometimes they donate them to other people. Other options include donating them to science, or in some cases, discarding them. Those may be options that are not available in Alabama anymore. We're still kind of waiting to hear more, but I've heard from families who say that clinics have called them and said that they can no longer discard or donate to science.
And that's a concern that we're hearing from a lot of readers right now, is that for people who are trying to get pregnant, or perhaps have gone through the IVF process and are trying to get pregnant again, what happens to their embryos that are currently being stored? Can they use them through providers like UAB right now while things are paused? Does that mean they're just not taking any new patients, or are they not doing any IVF with existing patients?
Well,
And can those embryos be moved to other facilities?
Yeah, I mean, UAB said they are pausing IVF. So I don't know if they're doing any transfers at all right now while they figure out, how to move forward. Basically, what this lawsuit endangers mostly are sort of discarding the embryos or donating them to science, both which would destroy, the embryos. And if, those are considered children, then that seems to be against Alabama law. And those may be options that are not available to people. And there's a lot of issues here, because sometimes when people divorce, they make arrangements for their frozen embryos, and often includes like an agreement to discard them. And some of those arrangements might be null and void at this point. I mean, I think a lot of people are really scrambling here to figure out how this impacts them.
And as of right now, the state is not going to pay to keep any of these embryos frozen, as far as we know. That this would continue to be a cost that's borne by patients at these clinics.
As far as I know, and it's not a small cost, it costs hundreds of dollars a year to store frozen embryos. So, I've seen in the $400 to $600 range. So it's a cost that moving forward could be borne for years. And even potentially, it's been mentioned, after the couple dies, maybe their children even have to sort of pick up this responsibility. Again, these are answers we don't have right now, but yeah, by defining frozen embryos as children, it certainly raises a lot of questions.
And I guess so far we're talking about a case that it relates to frozen embryos. But if the Supreme Court is saying that essentially a fertilized egg is a child, are there any cases right now that would take that out of the realm of IVF and put it in the realm of an ectopic pregnancy, for example, or a miscarriage? I don't want to fearmonger, but is there any cases right now that you know of that would advance this beyond the realm we're talking about right now?
Right now, I think this case is just concerning frozen embryos. But if we look in the past, we can see that this is not the first time the Alabama Supreme Court has issued a ruling that sort of redefined a fetus as a child. And that has had consequences for women who have had, miscarriages and stillbirths. I mean, specifically, I'm thinking of the chemical endangerment ruling, which basically took a law that was meant to protect children from in-home meth labs and translated it to apply to women who were pregnant and using drugs. We have since seen that law used against women who experienced miscarriages and stillbirths, and who were then prosecuted criminally if it was shown that they used drugs, even if sort of the connection between the drugs and the miscarriages was not really, scientifically proven. So I don't know. I don't want to fearmonger either. I think right now this mostly affects patients undergoing IVF and patients who have undergone IVF and who have embryos in storage. I don't necessarily think it affects, women who are having miscarriages right now.
And in reading the Supreme Court's ruling, there seemed to be an implication that they may feel the law is flawed, but that their hands are tied because this is the law as it is written. Is there any indication that the Alabama legislature is going to address this and to clarify that IVF can continue in Alabama during this session or in future sessions? Are you hearing anything about that?
I haven't heard that, but the Supreme Court decision definitely said that the responsibility would be with the legislature if they wanted to put together laws, regarding this. And they said their only job here was to look at the Alabama Constitution and see what it said and interpret it in that light, regardless of what the policy outcomes might be. So it will be up to the legislature to try to kind of adjust the law to make IVF accessible in Alabama if that's what they choose to do.
If a patient has their embryos stored at UAB right now, who has legal ownership over those embryos? Can they have those moved to another facility if they want, or is that at UAB's discretion?
I'm really not sure.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I can cut that. It just popped into my head. Well, finally, this is something that I'm sure a lot of couples are talking about right now. What questions should they be asking each other, and what questions should they be asking their healthcare provider? When trying to figure out ways to get pregnant in Alabama, or perhaps not in Alabama.
Yeah. So this ruling did not make IVF illegal, and IVF does not always create excess embryos that need to be stored. There are other ways of doing IVF to just create embryos that you want to use and have implanted. So couples could ask their provider about those options if that's something they're interested in. Beyond that, I think it can be more physically demanding to go that route because sometimes that results in pregnancies with multiples, twins, triplets, and sometimes that means you have to start the process at square one every time you want to get pregnant with a baby. So couples that are interested in having some embryos frozen, may have to talk about looking out of state depending on what happens next. It's really unclear right now. But yeah, it certainly seems that there are going to be some pretty immediate effects with UAB pausing its program soon. I'm sure we'll start to hear from other fertility centers about what they're choosing to do. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them try to move storage out of Alabama.
Well, Amy Yurkanin will be covering it up to the minute on AL.com, so please go there for the latest. And Amy, thank you for answering our questions today.
Thank you.